I love people. I love talking to them. I love listening to them. I love being around them. And when you love something, you want to learn more about it. That's why, when I was 17, I decided to study psychology. But the problem with that, there was no course that taught it in my home country, Jordan. So I wanted to go to London. But the problem with that was that London was expensive. So when I went to my mom and asked her, she told me no. So I did what any child in my situation would do if they want something. I went to my dad, and I asked him the same thing. Instead of telling me no, he told me, why? Why do you want to study psychology? And if you give me a reasonable answer, I might try to convince your mom. So I thought deeply about this, went back to him, and I told him, the reason I want to study psychology is because I am curious about the world. And in order to understand the world, you have to start with its core. You have to start with people. After that, he was convinced, and he talked to my mom, and both of them supported me to go to London. When I was there, I learned a lot about the brain and the body and how the two work together. I did the study where I poked people's fingers to get at their blood glucose level to see how that affects their thinking. I did another study when I put people on a brain scanner to see how their brain activity affects their mental health. I even got a picture of my own brain. But something was missing. Not in my brain, but in what I was studying. Everything I was studying about was on weird people. These are white, heterosexual, educated people living in industrialized, rich countries. And those weren't the people that I grew up with, which got me to thinking, maybe I wasn't curious about the world as such. Rather, I was really interested in understanding my world. So what was my world? Well, I wasn't sure, but I knew it had a lot of conflict and displacement. I knew that because a lot of my friends growing up were refugees from Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Even my own grandparents, they were Palestinian refugees who had to move from their home. So I knew that I wanted to study something about war and displacement and how it affects people. And I found a course in King's College London that did just that. This time I had a scholarship, so I didn't need my parents. But a surprise awaited me when I started that course. See, when I thought at that stage that I was done with weird people, because most people affected by conflict are not weird. But I didn't realize that even though when I was studying about weird people, even though when I was studying about other people, I was studying them through the weird lens. So to give you an example, a lot of my course was on war and psychiatry. So I learned a lot about PTSD, which is the only mental health condition that can be directly linked to the experiences of war and conflict. And for those of you who don't know, the context of PTSD and how it came about from after the Vietnam War. A lot of American soldiers, they came back from Vietnam to the US still feeling troubled about their experiences from the trauma they experienced back in Vietnam. And that's what PTSD came about. In other words, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a condition that arises after the trauma that happened. Hence why there's a post in post-traumatic stress disorder. The problem with this definition, it does not apply to millions of people who are displaced who never got the chance to leave their trauma. They're experiencing ongoing conflict, which didn't make sense to me. So I knew that I couldn't find my answers in textbooks. So instead, I decided to maybe go to the ground and meet people. Maybe there I could find my answers about my world. And that's when I decided to join UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. My job there was simple. It was to listen to people's stories and then decide whether they're refugees or not. One day, I was going through my schedule, and I saw a note that said, "Child, alone, no family." I remember feeling my heart tighten. I went downstairs to meet him. I remember it was a sunny day, so there was a lot of children playing outside with their families. But in the corner of my eye, I saw a child sitting alone. I approached him. He was no older than 13 years old. He had dusty clothes and feet. And when I looked at his eyes looked like if they've seen way beyond his age. His name was Sammy. I told Sammy to come with me to the interviewing room, which was a large metal box lit up with fluorescent light, and it had a small window as well. Sammy sat next to that window, and I gently asked him to tell me his story. Sammy began telling me about his family. He told me about the stories that his grandparents would tell him before going to bed. He told me about the affection that his mother gave him when he heard himself playing. He told me about the music he used to listen to with his cousins and dance to. And while he did tell me about how all of this was interrupted during the experiences of war, what he focused on was the experiences of love that kept him strong. He told me one day he was having dinner with his family when he heard an explosion. So he went running to his dad and hugged him. His dad told him, "La تخاف حبيبي أنا بحميك." Don't worry, my son, I will protect you. When I heard this, I was surprised. Here I was expecting stories of horror and trauma, and while he mentioned those, they weren't the center of his story. What the story was about the bonds that kept him strong during those difficult times. And over the course of my work at UNHCR, I've heard many stories, each with their own unique perspective, but all echoing the same sentiment, which got me to rethink what I learned in London. Western frameworks emphasize the problem, the damage. They look at the individual. But these don't capture the entirety of the human experience. But the thing is, what I learned was not incorrect. Rather, it was incomplete. And that's what I want to tell you today. In whatever field you're doing, whether you're working with people directly or indirectly, what I want you to do is not necessarily to shift your attention away from the problem, but rather to broaden your attention to focus on the interpersonal relationships surrounding the problem that you're dealing with. So how do you do it? Well, I'll tell you how I've done it. After my work at UNHCR, I decided to leave and do a Ph.D. in psychology, focusing on refugee children's mental health. And the reason is there's now more than 100 people displaced worldwide, and a disproportionate amount of them are children, and those children are affected. They have worse mental health outcomes than non-displaced children. Sometimes they externalize these mental health issues, like they scream and shout. Sometimes they internalize, like they become anxious and nervous and withdrawal, like Sammy. So instead of only focusing on the problem, which is the mental health of the refugee child, what I'm doing is broadening my attention to focusing on the bonds that surround that problem. And specifically, I'm focusing on the parent-child bond. And in order to support that bond, instead of focusing on the problem, which could be poor parenting skills, I'm broadening my attention to look at the relationship between the parent and the other parent. In other words, co-parenting. And what I mean by co-parenting here is two parents, whether they're biologically related to the refugee child or not, working together to support them. I realize that many of you don't work in a humanitarian context, but I think this message is important to you too. I think of myself back as a young researcher working on glucose levels and memory. What I would tell myself now is that this is important to look at this relationship, but what's also important to broaden your focus and look at the interpersonal dynamics that are involved. For example, how is the person getting their blood, getting their glucose? For example, in the case of a child, it probably is the parent. But even on a bigger picture thinking, I know some of you are interested in policy. I think this is important too. For a long time, I think policymakers or people who think about policy have assumed that people are rational actors, and recently they've started to realize that actually people can be sometimes irrational actors. But we're still stuck on this idea that people are lone actors. They think independently and make choices that concerns them. And it's time for us to move into our thinking into viewing people as relational actors, as also people making decisions about themselves in relation to others and how others think about them. Because, and that's the lesson that I learned, relationships are the world of people. So in order to help people, you need to understand the relationships. And this is the lesson that I learned through my experiences. But this lesson, I never found it in London. And I never found it traveling around in refugee camps and around the world. I found this lesson by talking to people just like Sami. In other words, the lesson was never in the destination, nor the journey. The lesson was in the company. Thank you.